Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the host of this show. If you are new to this show, go check out the archives because we've got some great interviews with smart CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs of all kinds of companies ranging from Netflix to Kinko's, YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard, LendingTree, OpenTable, and many more. I'm also the co-founder of Rise 25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And my guest here today is Richard Palarea. He is the CEO of Kermit, which is a Baltimore-based healthcare cost reduction and spending management company that brings automation and insight into the high spend category in implantable medical devices within hospitals and health systems. If that sounds like a big idea, we're going to dive into it and understand how the concept came around. He's a longtime founder and entrepreneur, has run other companies. And since its founding in 2011, Kermit has saved hospitals more than $200 million, which is amazing. So we're going to get into that in a moment. Of course, this is brought to you by Rise 25. For help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. You can go to rise25media.com to learn more about what we do. All right, Rich, I'm excited to have you here today. And we were joking beforehand about your journey to entrepreneurship. And I said that the obvious name for your biography, whenever you write it, autobiography, is Lemonade Stand Kid, because you said I was that kid who was out there doing lemonade stands as a kid. So take me back to your childhood. And, were you out there out hustling the other kids to sell more chocolate bars so that you could win the big prize? Tell me about that.
I don't have a lot of stories about when I was really young, although I do remember, I don't know if you're familiar with cyclothons or any of these kinds of things that are you do for the Heart Association or Lung Association. So my dad was a doctor, very involved in Long Beach, California, in the Heart Association in leadership positions and whatnot. So every year there was a cyclothon, and we'd get these sponsor sheets, and he just set me loose. Go knock on every door and see if you can get 10 cents a mile, whatever it might be. And I was this little scrawny kid, 10 years old. I'd show up at the door, knock on the door. And people would look out and they'd look down and find me and they'd say, what do you need? And I'd say, I'm riding the cyclothon with my dad. It's for the Heart Association. Would you mind sponsoring me? Sure. $1. I'll give you $1 a mile. I'll give it $2 a mile. Right. And they were thinking in their head, how far can this little kid go? After collecting all those sponsorships, I don't know how we did this. My dad, who was not an athlete, and me as a scrawny kid, would get on our 10-speed bikes and do the route. And that year, when I was 10 years old, we did 100 miles. And so I showed up, and they give you a tracker, right? Every time you pass the location, they check it off that it's legit. And so I show up to collect the checks, and these people in my neighborhood are like, wait a minute, there's no possible way I'll owe you $200. And sure enough, so I kind of got a taste for that. That really kind of excited me. Like, wow, you can go and you can kind of sell, and people get excited and they go on a journey with you, and then you collect money for it. And that was kind of interesting, kind of my first foray into that. My dad was not a businessman. I mean, he was a doctor in private practice. So I guess in a sense he was, but he always identified himself as a physician. My mom was a nurse when they met in the hospital, and later was a stay-at-home mom. So I didn't really see a lot of the entrepreneurial stuff. My grandparents escaped the Nazis during World War II from Hungary and were bakers. So my grandmother ran the deli and the bakery, and she was always managing the cash register. My grandfather was in the back making bagels and donuts and cakes and things. Wow. So maybe a little bit of that. But I do remember one kind of very, very pivotal time in my life. I was 16 years old. I just got my driver's license. I'm in Southern California. And at the time, we lived in a gated community. And inside of the gates, in addition to the homes, there was a historical site there. It was a rancho. And you think about, we were talking before you started recording about the history And there isn't much deep history in California.
Not in Southern California, for
They
sure.
don't date back all that much. But what we do have are these ranchos that go back to the time of Father Sarah, basically.
Yeah.
And so we had one in our community, and every summer it would open up for a full day. They'd have Rancho Day, and people would come from all over Southern California to tour the rancho. The problem is they couldn't drive through the gated community. So they had to park down at the bottom of the hill. Long Beach State University is down there, so there's plenty of parking, but they would queue up on the sidewalk and wait for a van to come pick them up. At different intervals, the van would go up, come back down, pick them up. So I was out doing something with my parents. We were driving home. I noticed the line.
They look hot. They needed something to drink.
Exactly. They were all sweating. They looked miserable. And my mom, we get home and I said, "Can I borrow the car?" And she had a beast of a Cadillac Sedan DeVille, 4-door, just battleship. And the air conditioning was cranked up. And I'm thinking, okay, there might be something to this. So I took a little cup, I taped it to the dashboard. I put a little sign on the side of the car. It said Rich's Taxi. And I went down and picked up my first group of people, and they were ecstatic.
Oh, so not even, I thought you were going to sell them water or something like that. You gave them a ride.
Picked them up in the car, and it was air conditioned, and and I had a little sticker in the front window that would let me get through the gate. So I didn't wait. I just zipped right up, and I was lapping the van. I mean, I saw the van, and he was looking at me like, "What are you doing?" And I think it was probably about 3 hours later. I had filled the tip jar. Cash was just falling out of the top of it. It's probably a couple $100. And my dad got home from work and he shut down the operation. I don't think we have insurance to cover you to do this. But that was my dad, like very practical. But just go out and look at what resources you have around and look at the need and see if you can meet a need. And I did that over and over and over again. So I'm very much kind of matched that journey on the way to entrepreneurship of being kind of in that lane.
And you have another great story. So after you graduated, you did sales for a real estate appraisal company, and then the company ends up going out of business, I imagine for mismanagement or something like that. But you realized, I got good relationships with these mortgage brokers. Maybe I could salvage this. And you kind of said to yourself, like, if I don't try it now, I'm going to be kicking myself for not.
Right. And I go back to Mr. Practical, my father, he's my sounding board. So I'd go to him and say, "Dad, what do you think? I mean, I'm out of college. I need to get a job. But I've got this situation over here. And I feel like you just said, John, if I don't try this, I'll always be wondering in the back of my head, could this have succeeded? Was there something there?" And Mr. Practical says to me, go get a job, son. You need to go get a job. And I listened to that, but I thought for a moment and I said, it's not in my heart. I'll always be wondering. So I basically printed a business card, filed for an S corp, and started a real estate appraisal company, really with no experience other than I knew I had the mortgage broker relationships. So I hired back all of the appraisers who the company let go, and they worked on a 1099 basis for me. It was a great business. It was all cash. You would go out and do an appraisal. As long as it was daylight, you were doing inspections. And every time you did an inspection, you would take money at the door, usually a check. So you could do in Southern California in daylight savings time, you could do 10 or 12 of those in a day. Yeah. So for somebody who was 21 years old to come home with, a couple $1,000s a day in their pocket was phenomenal. And so I did that for a good long time until, let's see, it would have been the 80s. So George Bush 1 was in the office when we had that first savings and loan big bailout situation, and a lot of savings.
The original real estate meltdown. Did that hit your business hard?
Oh, very hard. Yeah, it was. I was in Lincoln Savings and Loan watching Charles Keating being taken out in handcuffs when that all happened, and my appraisals were being called into court. And for a young kid, I didn't know anything about witness testimony or any of that. So,
did you have to testify?
I did once or twice. I had to go in.
That's a pretty frightening experience. What was that like?
Yeah. And well, there were no, back then, there was no regulation. You didn't have to have a license to be a real estate appraiser. Unbelievable.
Really? That's unbelievable now. Yeah.
Yeah. So as long as you kind of follow the uniform appraisal form and you follow the guidelines that were standard and accepted, then your appraisals could be accepted anywhere. And they were making, large loans off of some of these appraisal reports. Yeah. The problem was they were asking certain appraisers to inflate their valuations.
Yeah.
I was never in that situation, fortunately, so I never had to deal with that pressure. But I always took the ethics part of what I was doing very seriously. So yeah, so I was called into court a couple of times. I just answered yes sir, no sir, and I was done. So it wasn't that big of a deal. It was quite intimidating, but there were no appraisals. The whole market just collapsed at that point. So I basically said, what am I going to do? At the time, I was really enjoying the lifestyle. In my 20s, I owned an income producing property. I owned my own house. I had a boat. I had 2 cars, and it was all cash. And I didn't have any concept of what it was like to pay taxes. Mm-hmm. So when the business stopped and the tax bill came, I said, wow, I'm in a bad place. My dad said, don't worry. You understand computers. I'll hire you to come run the front office of my practice, his doctor's office, because the folks that were there at the time were using IBM Selectric typewriters to type up his patient statement. And so the era of computers were here and they couldn't make the leap. So he said, you come do this. I'll pay you a generous salary. I said, okay, Dad, I'm in. What do you want to pay me? He's like, $21,000. And so
is that generous?
In his mind, that was very generous. I guess.
God.
I guess maybe the elderly females that were there were making less, but it was far less than when I was doing appraisals. I had, I was like $150,000 a year in cash doing appraisals.
Wow.
But it took me on this different journey, and it was a journey of faith. I learned kind of my purpose. I was very humbled in all of that, going from kind of where I was to then working for my father. And as a precious time, John, and not a lot of people get to spend time with their dad, especially in the work environment before they pass away. And so my dad passed away only a few years later. So it was a very sweet, precious time for me where I got to spend every day with him, working in his business and with him in his business and having lunch every day. And I'll always cherish that.
Yeah. What was it like, coming into a business that was owned by your father, and the father says to the existing staff, here's my son, he's going to make this massive change from typewriters to computers, go.
It was crazy because, if you think about it, as a kid, I grew up going to that office. I'd either go there for checkups or I go there to hang out with my dad in the summer. We just always would just visit. So that was family. Those people were family to us. We had them over for barbecues and whatnot. I knew their kids really well. So it was a little strange, but at the same time, I think they always saw this coming. And it got to the point where my dad was doing so much stuff for the government, taking care of police officers, fire department and things, that he had to get on computerized billing. That was the only way he was going to get paid. So he had to make the transition. I think they knew it was coming, but it was almost a wholesale change overnight. He let them go, kept the nurses, let the office staff go. And then boom, it was just me. And I didn't really know anything about his business. So I had to learn, how to do the Medicare billing and the coding and make the bank deposits. And it was kind of the first introduction to the operations part that I was already doing in the appraisal company, but it was somebody else's business. And it felt like the stakes were high because it was not only just medical practice, but it was my dad. Like I didn't want to do a poor job there. So
now a lot of these small, family practices where there's one, but I don't know how many doctors he had, but
just himself. Yeah.
So what happened? Were you still there when he passed away? What happened to the business when he passed away?
Really sad story, John. So he suffered a number of very small strokes over a long period of time. And I think it was happening for a while before my mother and I and my siblings knew what was happening. But one day he said to me, we were at home, it was a weekend. And he said, have you seen my thing? And I said, what, Dad? What do you mean, what thing? He goes, the thing you hold in your hand. I said, what are you talking about? He goes, the thing you pull through your hair to make it look better. Your comb? He goes, yeah, have you seen my comb? And I ran and told my mom, I said, I've never seen him like this. He's very articulate, very smart, typical doctor, right? Great problem solver. And it turns out that he'd had these number of small ischemic attacks that are starting to kind of like chew away at his ability to connect what he already knew in his head. He could see the comb. He couldn't connect that thought to his mouth. It's very frustrating for him as a doctor. And I watched these happen. One day, we would always close the office at noon so we could have lunch. So we closed the office from noon to 1. Nobody would come in. We would have lunch, sometimes together, sometimes apart. And he was having lunch in his office. I was doing something on the computer, having lunch, and I heard a thud. I thought, that's odd. I got up out of my desk. I went down the hallway and I saw him laying in the hallway, white coat on, just laying unconscious in the hallway. I called 911. He revived before the paramedics showed up, but he got up and got on his feet and told a very cogent story to the paramedics. I just had a transient ischemic attack. I'm fine. It's happened before. And he was really good at that. He's kind of shooing away everybody from his problem because he could talk the talk. But when I witnessed it, John, I said, Dad, we're in a situation now that's dire. You can't be practicing medicine. I knew at least that much in my young 20s. This is a huge risk. We have to do something. And he really resisted closing the office because I think he knew in his mind, he was defined by that job. He was a doctor. And yes, he was a husband and a father, but he was a doctor. And to end that chapter in his life meant that he really didn't have a lot of meaning. And that's why that journey for me was so important, where I found meaning at that time too. So unfortunately, when he finally agreed to close the office, it was only a few years before he just deteriorated so quickly without purpose in his life and succumbed to those strokes. And eventually there was a heart attack. So that's what happened.
Yeah. I want to ask about April 1992, end of April 1992, April 25th to be precise.
Okay.
I believe that's the date. The Rodney King riots happened in Los Angeles. You're in Los Angeles. You haven't met your wife yet, but by coincidence, she's on a plane on her way to Los Angeles with smoke rising above LA. She's on a journey to try to become an actress. You're still, at this point, I think you are running a real estate business.
That's right. I was appraising real estate. Yeah.
Right. And you actually were driving in the area where the riots broke out. Take me back to what that was like.
Yeah. Florence and Normandy was the flashpoint where they yanked Rodney King out of the truck. And I was a couple blocks away from there. One of my clients had sent me up there to do a couple of appraisals in the morning, and got out of there and was headed south on the highway, on the freeway, as we call it in California. I was on the freeway coming back home to write up those reports. And I was listening on the radio to the news, and they just said some general unrest. No, they didn't really say what it was. And as I got closer home, the story was developing that it was, they were trying to figure out like what created this, but it started to become, it was proliferating from the intersection out toward the general area. So there were fires that had broken out. There were windows being smashed. There were mobs starting to amass. And all I remember was I had one of the first cell phones ever in cars back then. The kind of thing that was like
early
this
days,
big, that it was like trunk mounted, and you put it on a strap to take it out of the car. And I called my mom and I said, "Are you watching the news?" She said, "Yes. Here's what's happening." And she said, "This reminds me of when you were born in 1965. We had riots in Watts in LA, and they started to come south. And I was so scared that something was going to happen. They were going to finally eventually make their way toward South LA and Long Beach, where I was born, where I was from, that I would lose you as a baby." And so she's like freaking me out now. And I'm like, well, what's going to happen? So I finally get home and yeah, it was, as you know, the rest is history, as they say. So that was a terrifying time. I mean, nobody really knew what was going to happen. And it was a few months later, I did meet Juliet. And she told me the day she arrived. Yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah. And she actually was how you got into kind of the line of work you're in now. So helping other companies to reduce their costs. So she worked in telecom, and she was their number one salesperson for MCI, a company, big, massive telecommunication company at the time. Tell us about how she got into that area of helping other companies to reduce their costs.
So as you said, she was selling long distance lines, T1s at the time, before we had fiber, right? And I kid her to this day. I'll say, "Juliet, what's a T1?" She's like, "Don't ask me the question. I can't answer it for you. You know that." She's a great, phenomenal salesperson. She did really well in the Philly market. They transferred her to LA. She thought, you know what, I'll go to LA because I want to become an actress anyway. That's what I really want to do. And as you mentioned, there was that visual of the plane landing at LAX, but smoke coming up from the floor of the city. And she tells a story about how her dad called her and said, like, what are you doing? You want to come home? This can't be good. So she was in telecom for a while. The whistleblower situation happened at MCI, which took that company down. It's a really good company, but unfortunate situation. And from that, she had a lot of knowledge about how the cost side of this worked. And she went to go work for somebody who was doing telecom cost reduction. And she would go out and meet with CFOs and say, I'll help you reduce your telecom expenses, and I'll only take a portion of what I save you as my fee. And she was doing that for a couple of years, and she wasn't making a ton of money, but the person that she worked with was making a ton of money. And they decided to try to kind of cut her commission. And I remember going, I left my dad's medical practice to go pick her up for lunch one day. She worked right down the street. And I got to the office and I knocked on the door. Nobody answered. So I opened the door and I walked in, and they were in a private meeting in the conference room. I just heard a lot of yelling. And I thought, wow, I'm not going to interrupt this. But you know what? If I can get her out of here and we can start our own version of this, we should do it. And I left her a little handwritten note. I put it on her windshield. And I said, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. We're going to do this without these jerks. And she got home that night in tears. It was a really rough day. And the next week we started PA and Associates, which was doing telecom cost reduction, and competed against that company, did better than that company, and added other services, including logistics spend management and parcel cost reduction. So she would go out and sell all day long, which is what she was really good at. I had a full-time job doing something else. I'd come home and I'd deliver on everything she sold. I'd do all the back office work, the billing, the analysis, the negotiations against the telecom companies and shipping companies, the marketing, and kind of kept the business operations going. So it was like a 24/7 thing. She'd work in the day, I'd work in the night. And we made that work. And that was the business I was running when I started Kermit, actually. So
what's kind of interesting to me is that from the story you told about being a kid and kind of hustling and doing sales as a kid, you strike me as someone who's good at sales. And yet you took the role of running the back office. A lot of times people have different types of personalities. They don't tend to do well in both of those types of roles. So how did you reconcile those two? How do you manage to be, someone who naturally is inclined towards sales, which is what I kind of get from you, and also manage the back office?
Yeah, it's interesting you're getting the sales vibe, because that's something that I've really wanted to kind of perfect and be better at. It doesn't come naturally for me. If I get very passionate about something, I can explain something to somebody and kind of take them on that emotional journey, and maybe they end up buying. But I'm more of an operations person. I like the details of things. I can see how things fit together to solve problems. I can spend my entire day in a spreadsheet. That doesn't bother me. And making sure the formulas are connected and say, hey, I figured that out, and that's good. So I think that's really helped me build businesses along the way, because even here at Kermit, with the exception of programming the software, I've done, and my partners have, every other job in this business. For the first couple of years, we had to. So I've worn the marketing hat, the CFO hat, the HR hat, I've, done it all. And after the 10-year journey, we started this 10 years ago, I feel like I'm finally freed to be the CEO of the company, finally have all the key people in all the right seats, and now go on kind of the next journey and do more of that, speaking, working with partners, finding investors, finding M&A partners, and doing that kind of work. But it's not what truly comes naturally to me. The operations piece, I can get lost in that for hours. Yeah.
And I also want to ask about you, for family reasons, you and your wife was from the East Coast, Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. Right. You're from Southern California.
That's
20
right.
years ago, you decided that for family reasons, you need to move back to the East Coast. I think it's fascinating that you had this business in Southern California, the expense reduction business, and you kept it open and you ran it from a distance, which was not something that people did 20 years ago. It was a lot harder to do then. The tools were a lot more limited. So how did you manage to keep this business and not have to sell it or fold it when you moved all the way across the country?
Yeah, there was no Zoom back then.
No.
Email was actually expensive, to actually have like service and broadband and all that stuff. And back in that day, it was probably dial-up still. What we ended up doing was we had somebody who worked at FedEx. She was a senior account manager at FedEx, who kind of became disillusioned with working for the big company and wanted to do something on her own. She was having her first child at the same time we were having our first child. So she was on this kind of journey that's very much parallel with Juliet, my wife. And they got to know each other. And she said, look, if you want to, why don't you come help us with this company? You can work down in Orange County. We'll work up here in LA. And, you just eat what you kill kind of a thing. And when we left, we put the business in her hands, and she was in charge of the West. And we started a brand new business out here in the East. And here's one thing that I wasn't prepared for. And those of your listeners and watchers who are from the market in Baltimore will understand what I mean by this. We call it Smaltimore here. That's what it's called. And it's because, we were here one Christmas visiting my father-in-law and mother-in-law. At the time, we had a 2-year-old child. And I flew out separately. Juliet picks me up from the airport, and I'm seeing all these stickers on the backs of cars. I said, why do you guys have a lot of colleges here? She says, those aren't colleges. Those are high schools. I said, those are all private high schools? She said, yeah, that's how it works here. And that's the network in Maryland. So when we started the business on the East, we would go into, large financial offices like Legg Mason, for example, and we pitch our service, and they say, this is great. Yes, we'll get you started right away. Just this one-page contract. They'd sign it on the spot. And they'd say, okay, great. Now, where'd you go to school? And I'd say, what do you, San Diego State? Like, no, not college, high school. I'm like, Woodrow Wilson High School in Long Beach, California. Like, how would you ever, why would you care? And I started to see what this was all about. There's a network here that's very generational. Whereas if I go just an hour south to Washington, D.C., it's a lot more transient, like I'm used to in Southern California. So, in Southern California, you were in a private school because you had some kind of a need. Everybody went to public school. So we had to kind of learn that whole thing when we came here and started the business here. And eventually we were doing business nationally, and we didn't have to have the distinction of East Coast, West Coast. The business grew to a point where it was just, it was what it was. And we went wherever we needed to go.
That's a great point about those kind of regional particularities. What did you do? Did you end up hiring around it? Like hire some people that were local and that were parts of those different private high school communities?
For the most part, in order to, so this is kind of a fascinating story that we're still using today here at Kermit. I didn't have a sales force in those days. Everything was referral based, and I just paid a commission. And we formalized the program, called it Market Connectors. And we just had people who, as their side hustle, they would just refer deals to us. And because we were doing telecom cost reduction and shipping cost reduction, we would find telecom reps who didn't want us coming into their territory and taking their margin. And we say, just introduce us to your clients and we'll only do the shipping part. And so what we do is put them under agreement, and they bring us business all day long to protect their business and also to earn a commission. And so that became this kind of formal thing that we launched an international sales force from. They were 1099. We didn't have to put them on payroll. And so here at Kermit, we still are doing this Market Connectors thing where people who want to introduce us to hospitals, all we want is the introduction. We'll take it from there. If it turns into revenue producing deal, then we'll cut them a commission for the period in which we're sharing in that. So it works really well. We do have a sales force here. We just hired a chief growth officer this year as part of our growth plan, and he has a national sales force. We still have this idea that anybody wants to bring us a deal, we'll get a commission. So
what would you say to someone who's listening to this about this? I love this Market Connectors idea. And I think lots of business owners, love the idea of, having a force of referral partners out there where I pay a commission to. What would you say to someone listening to this about how to structure something like that, how to set something like that up for their business?
I would say this, John, it's probably, here's what not to do. Basically, it's not enough to just offer them a healthy commission, because most people already have some kind of thing they're doing during the day for pay. So money tends to not be the thing that drives people. But if you give them some reason to do it, in the case of what I just explained, there was a protective reason. They didn't want us coming in and chopping their revenues. So they were doing that. When we were doing primarily, during the meltdown of telecom, and that eventually went away, we were just doing shipping in the latter years of that organization. I would actually go to FedEx and say, FedEx didn't have the market share, UPS did. But FedEx in my territory or here in my local area would say, let me blueprint all the UPS accounts I'm trying to get into, and you just get me a chance to bid. And that's enough. So there's a way, if you can figure out what is the relationship, what does somebody want? And this is the truest sense of all negotiation, right? It's not that one wins and one loses. That's how we think about, or to think about it incorrectly, like it's a compromise. It's not a compromise. It's that you need something and I need something. How can we both get what we need inside of that same agreement? And that's what negotiation is about. So if you can find a reason to have a community who is incentivized to bring you those leads, the money is just kind of extra for them. They really enjoy it. They enjoy the hunt. They enjoy working with somebody different, all those different aspects. Have a really good agreement that makes sense. It shouldn't be too hard to understand. It should be fair, but it should set up some of the eventualities you're going to get into. Like, what if that referral person exhausts all their resources, but they're very enterprising and they have a bunch of friends who they can tap? Are they still getting commission, or do the friends get the full commission? Like, we had to come up with all these different permutations of how this was going to work. So you got to kind of think a little bit ahead of the game about what could possibly happen and try to bake that into your model.
Yeah, that's great. I want to ask you about, you had a pivotal discussion. So two medical device representatives came in, had a conversation with you, and they basically told you a story that was the germination of Kermit, your current business, which is cost reduction in the healthcare parameter. So you go in more narrow, still cost reduction, but just in the healthcare world. What was that conversation? How did that happen?
So at the time, I was still running PA and Associates, which was the shipping cost reduction company. I had an attorney who was helping me for many years since I moved to Baltimore, the first legal relationship I ever made. And he'd help me with contracts and different disputes and things like that. That attorney was also trying to help my current business partners who came out of Zimmer Biomet Corporation, so big global manufacturer of lots of different implantable medical devices, where they were salespeople for 10 years apiece in the Baltimore region. And they would stand in the operating room with the surgeon during these surgeries. And they were trying to set up, they were disillusioned with this ceiling on their earnings and having the distributorship they work for making all of the revenue. And also kind of being told how to keep things less than transparent, let's just say, in the hospital as far as the billing goes. So if you want to add an extra screw to the bill or an extra drill bit, nobody's really going to know. And so they kind of knew what they could get away with. I think that kind of ate at them after a while. And so they decided together, before they knew me, let's leave Zimmer Biomet. Let's start a business with all the knowledge we have. Let's go back to our clients and let's show them what we know and how we could save them money. Maybe if they let us help negotiate the cost of these implants, we can take a portion of the savings as our fee. And the attorney heard the story and said, Rich does exactly this very thing in a different industry. I think you guys just ought to go get together, have coffee, whatever. So they came into my office, and that was the story, John. They told me, we stand in the operating room with a surgeon. We don't provide patient care. We're only there to tender medical devices into the sterile field as they're being called on. There's no price tag on the box. The doctor doesn't know what it costs. And when the doctor gets into a jam, for example, the patient has osteoporosis, soft bone, and I need a longer implant that's going to be more fixated into the bone. The job of the rep is to kind of bail them out and have trays and trays and trays of lots of options of implants for that one weird time when the surgeon says, hey, John, I need something different. And John pulls it out and sends it into the sterile field. And that something different could cost multiples more, but nobody really knows. And so they're peeling barcode stickers off the boxes. They're affixing those to a piece of paper. They're tallying what's been sold during the surgery, and they're writing down what they expect to be paid. They get a nurse to sign that in the operating room. Then they leave the OR and they walk down the hallway to procurement, and they turn in that piece of paper to purchasing to a person, and they're expecting a purchase order, to a person that doesn't have any clinical understanding of why the surgeon used what he or she did in surgery. So you have this, it's being bought by the surgeon, but the hospital has to pay, and neither party is collaborating on whether or not the bill is even correct. And it's paper-based. And so when I kind of saw all of these different intersections, it was healthcare, it was IT, it was still paper-based. Like, when do you ever find that?
Even going back to what you did with your father's practice. Yeah.
All of that. It was kind of a big journey, rolling forward. And I thought for a second, like, this is interesting. We could try to innovate here, but like, do I really want to start another business? I could just forget we ever had this conversation and go back to what I was doing and everything's great. Or we could really not only start a business, but really change the whole paradigm of how this has been done this way for 50 years. Could we really come in and innovate and really change everything? And now look back on it 10 years later, Kermit manages 40% of the implant spend that transacts in the state of Maryland today. So I would say, yes, we fundamentally have changed the way this works. And now we're ready to scale. I mentioned we have somebody in charge of sales. We have a full sales force. We have a full-time marketing person, HR, finance, everything is ready to go. And we can now go tell the story outside of Maryland for the rest of the nation. So that's the next journey of growth for us.
That's really cool. And reflecting back on it now, 10 years in, this is a very different type of business than the previous businesses that you had. You said the previous businesses are kind of like lifestyle businesses, much bigger challenges, bigger team. Reflect back on some of the bigger challenges that you've had and that you experience now. I realize that's not the best question to ask because there's probably a million different things, but you could have stayed, you could have not decided to go forward and take on this new challenge. So are you glad that you did it?
I'm really glad I did it. I would say probably the biggest thing, I know it's a broad question, but one thing really stands out for me. And that's the fact that when you're running your own thing, it's not really a company. And I don't mean to disparage anybody who's an entrepreneur, but a sole proprietor, because that's a journey. And I went on that journey with the real estate appraisal company. I went on that journey with a couple of other things I started. I was doing graphic design and building websites and things like that. I did it when I was doing the shipping cost reduction stuff. But the journey of a solopreneur, when you make decisions in the business and you have to live with that, it's just you. You don't have to worry about the team. Yes, I had a few employees here and there that helped me with different things, but we weren't building a large organization with HR concerns and everything else that goes with that. So it's a lonely existence. I mean, when you have a big win, who do you celebrate with? High five myself. That's about all you get to do, right? So it's totally different. But I could equate it to, I played team sports and I played some solo stuff too. Where's a better fit? I mean, they both have their advantages and their disadvantages, but the big leap coming over to Kermit was Jason and John, my two co-founders, and myself, just the three of us when we started. And it was all about subject matter expertise. They knew the implant space. They knew hospitals. I only knew hospitals because my dad would take me on his rounds on Sunday morning, stick me in the doctor's lounge with a box of donuts and a TV. And if I wasn't kidnapped, come take me home at the end of the day, So I didn't really know of the hospital. I was comfortable in the environment, but they stood in the operating room. So it was a totally different thing. So taking that subject matter expertise and me on the business and operations side, it was kind of like the journey of the shipping business. Like they were doing all the SME work. I was doing kind of everything else. And the two were a really good pair. And it just so happened that in the first year, we landed two hospitals, saved them respectively $3 million and $5 million each.
Wow.
And I said, I'm not being an effective CEO of either organization. I need to get rid of my baby, my 25-year business. So I really didn't think that was actually going to happen. When they came in, I'm like, let's just try a joint venture. We'll see what kind of happens. And I was fortunate and it worked out. And now we're at 26 employees in like 7 different states. Wow. And it's more of a corporate structure. So it's been an interesting journey to go from there to here. The one thing I'll say though, it was tough and it still is for me. I like to move at my own pace. When I see there's something to do and I know I can get it done, I would just I'm a get it done kind of person. And when you have a team of people, you can't really do that. You have to all go together. So that's been a real journey for me. And even I've gotten much better at it, but there are some mentors that I have who've really kind of instilled in me, look, you're going to go further as a team. You'll go faster by yourself, but much further as a team. Think about that as you start to build the organization. That's
great. You handled a really poorly worded question with a lot of skill. So I appreciate that.
Awesome.
This has been great learning about your background and Kermit and everything. I know we're out of time. Rich, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. Where can people go to learn more about you, connect with you, and learn more about Kermit?
Sure. So the first place would be our website, kermitppi.com, KERMITPPI.com. The PPI stands for physician preference items. That preference part is very curious. We can talk about that on another show. And on the website, there's a really quick little explainer video that kind of in a nutshell tells your viewer why we do what we do, what's the problem we solve. It's worth watching it for 2 minutes. Definitely find us on LinkedIn. If you look up Kermit, and if it's not a frog, it's probably us. And we do a lot of content creation on LinkedIn. We do videos. Most of my podcast work is up there too, and interviews I've done and things like that. And we post stuff on our blog all the time, but really interesting content about why is it important to reduce healthcare costs and how can we do it when physicians want what they want and they're very concerned with outcomes. But we also have the business side of running a hospital. What happens when the numbers don't line up, and why is that really important, especially in the era of a pandemic? So it's been a very interesting time to be in healthcare over the past 2 years. So those are probably the two places I would say. And then I manage my own profile on LinkedIn. I'm very active there and post and write articles and things. So
great, Rich. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Sean. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
Revolution.
And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.